Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The night she arrived, the midwife swore the constellation above the eaves clicked softly, like distant wind chimes, each star in Rattlestar tapping the next in patient sequence, as if the sky were counting down to something precious. Mira's mother, Elena, had labored through the longest night of autumn while outside. The familiar constellation rearranged itself into patterns that looked almost like ancient writing across the velvet darkness. The midwife, Petra, paused in her work as the child drew her first breath, tilting her weathered head toward sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Once, a gentle rattling that had no earthly source yet filled the small stone cottage with its rhythm. They said later that the house itself seemed to exhale at the moment of birth, candle flames leaning toward the window, as if drawn by invisible threads. The old dog outside lifted its head, ears tilted to catch something just beyond hearing, while the crickets fell quiet in respectful attention. The rattling sound wove itself through the rafters and under the floorboards, behind their ribs and into their bones, a cosmic percussion that none of them could place, but all of them felt. Eleanor's exhausted sigh of relief harmonized with it, and Thomas, Mira's father, found his gentle weeping keeping time with its unhurried pulse. Mira's first sleep was not to lullabies, though her mother hummed, and her father whispered soft welcomes, but to that delicate celestial rhythm. It followed her into her earliest days like a faithful companion, a private symphony that never demanded attention so much as offered it, lightly, like sunlight through leaves. As she grew from infant to toddler, the sound evolved, becoming more complex, more communicative. Different patterns seemed to mean different things. A quick, light rattling might herald the first flowers of spring, while deeper, more resonant tones preceded approaching storms or the arrival of visitors. Their cottage sat on the edge of Seren's Rest, where cobblestones gave way to packed earth and the kind of herb garden that snakes prefer. In those early years, Mira's world was this gentle labyrinth of thyme and lavender, rosemary and sage, where the afternoon sun warmed the stones just right for small creatures to rest. The first time a snake paused for her, she was barely 3, small enough that the sun-dappled stone reached her knees. She had been testing its warmth with her palm when a slender grass snake slid into view and simply stayed. They regarded one another quietly, in that way children and wild things sometimes do, without urgency or fear. Mira did not reach to touch, and the snake did not flee. Between them, the afternoon widened into something like a held breath, and she found herself understanding the serpent's mood, the way one understands the temperature of water. Contentment, simple and complete, with a thread of gentle alertness running beneath like a current under still water. Her parents, watching from the kitchen window, saw their daughter surrounded by a peace so profound it seemed to emanate from her very presence. Wherever Mira walked, the earth settled into a deeper quiet. Flowers bloomed with unusual vigor around her, and the small creatures that lived in and around their garden showed no fear of her approach. Birds would land near her during afternoon walks, and field mice would emerge from hiding places to watch her pass with curious recognition. But it was the snakes that responded most profoundly, as if recognizing something in her that even she didn't yet understand. Her grandmother, Naya, watched these early manifestations with eyes that held knowing rather than surprise. Naya had been born under the same constellation 70 years earlier, and carried in her weathered hands the memory of similar gifts. She was the village's keeper of old stories, the one who remembered when the lines between human and natural worlds were drawn with gentler ink. Over cups of chamomile tea and slices of honey bread, she began to share the family's quiet heritage with Elena and Thomas. Some families carry particular songs, Naya explained one evening, as Mira slept peacefully in her wooden cradle, the cosmic rattling soft as whispered prayers around them. Ours sounds like this. She let a pinch of dried fennel seeds fall between her palms, their tiny rattles tumbling like miniature stars. We don't own it. We just know how to hear it. She touched a small pendant at her throat, a smooth coil of polished bone carved in the shape of a spiral. The snakes remember things we've forgotten. They remember when fear hadn't yet built walls between the species. As Mira's 4th birthday approached, the rattling began to carry what felt almost like meaning, Not words exactly, but impressions that reached her in the quiet moments before sleep. Stay, the rhythm seemed to whisper, not as command but as kindness. Listen, keep close. She would fall asleep by the window, head tilted toward the stars, as if someone were speaking softly from that vast darkness. And in her dreams, she walked through gardens where every creature spoke in languages of feeling rather than sound. The village had its opinions about the odd family on the edge of town, but Seren's Rest had always been a place where unusual gifts were quietly accepted rather than feared. Generations had learned that wisdom lay in respectful coexistence with the mysteries that pressed close on all sides. And so Mira grew, cradled by cosmic rhythms and earthly love, her gift unfurling like a night-blooming flower, patient and sure, waiting for the moment when listening would become a bridge between worlds that had forgotten how to speak to one another. By her 7th year, the rattling had learned to speak in patterns that bloomed like flowers in the quiet spaces of her mind. What had once been gentle background music now carried distinct meanings that Mira felt rather than heard. A soft triple tap that preceded her father's return from the village market, a longer rolling murmur that meant rain would kiss the garden stones before morning. She began to understand that the constellation above was not merely making sound, but offering a kind of celestial conversation that required no words because it operated in the deeper currents beneath language, where others saw scattered points of light, arranged in familiar but meaningless patterns. Mira perceived something far more wondrous. Rattlestar revealed itself to her as a great cosmic serpent, its scales catching and reflecting the light of distant suns in deliberate sequence. Each star held its own emotional resonance, this one warm with contentment, that one touched with gentle melancholy, the brightest one at the serpent's heart, pulsing with the kind of love that asks nothing and gives everything. When she tried to share this vision with her mother, Eleanor would settle beside her at the bedroom window, lavender tea warming her hands, and listen with the patient understanding of someone who loves what she cannot fully comprehend. "Show me what you see, little star," Elena would whisper, and Mira would trace the serpent's form across the night sky, her small finger following invisible scales from head to tail. Helena couldn't see the cosmic serpent or hear the rattling, but she could see the peace that settled over her daughter during these midnight conversations. And that was enough. Her love became another kind of anchor, keeping Mira tethered to her human self even as her gift pulled her deeper into the serpent realm. In the herb garden behind their cottage, Mira's abilities began to manifest in ways that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. The small grass snakes that lived among the rosemary and thyme no longer simply tolerated her presence. They sought it with something that felt remarkably like recognition. Through patient observation and quieter listening, she learned to distinguish their individual emotional signatures. The mild irritation of a young snake, whose favorite sunning spot had been claimed by a particularly bold toad. The deep contentment of an elder warming herself on the flat stone beside the mint patch. The ancient patience that seemed to flow through all serpents, like a slow eternal river, carrying memories from the world's beginning. It was Whisper who became her first true teacher in this wordless language. The elderly snake's scales had faded to the color of moonlight, and her movements carried the deliberate grace of great age. She appeared one morning when the dew still clung to spiderwebs like scattered diamonds, coiling herself into a perfect spiral on Mira's favorite garden stone, and simply waiting. When Mira approached, she felt no fear, only curiosity tinged with something deeper, a recognition that seemed to echo from the stars themselves. The communication that developed between them was unlike anything in Mira's human experience. It was not telepathy as stories described it, with clear thoughts passing from mind to mind, but rather a sharing of emotional landscapes, a communion of feeling that required no translation, because it spoke directly to the heart. Through Whisper, Mira learned that snakes experienced time as a vast, slow river, rather than the quick stream of human consciousness. What felt like a moment to her might contain lifetimes of serpent contemplation, layers of memory and sensation that unfolded like flowers blooming in extreme slow motion. Her grandmother Naya watched these developments with eyes that held both wonder and gentle concern. She had possessed similar gifts in her youth, though hers had never reached the depth and clarity that seemed to flow so naturally through Mira. During their afternoon walks through the village, where cobblestones gave way to packed earth, and the air smelled of baking bread and herb gardens. Naya began to share the practical wisdom that came with such abilities. The gift requires great gentleness, Naya explained as they paused beside the old stone well, where carved serpents wound around the rim in an endless spiral. Not just with the creatures, but with yourself. You are learning to carry emotions that were never meant for human hearts. Some days the connection will flow like clear water. Other days your own worries will create ripples that make it impossible to hear clearly. She touched the bone pendant at her throat, its spiral catching the afternoon light. On those days you rest. You tend your own garden first. The lessons proved necessary as Mira's sensitivity grew stronger with each passing season. She could now sense the emotional states of every snake within considerable distance of their cottage, their feelings flowing through her awareness like a gentle but constant stream. She learned that the garden snakes formed a complex community with its own social dynamics, hierarchies based not on dominance, but on wisdom and experience. Whisper was clearly an elder, her emotional presence carrying the weight of many seasons, and the kind of deep knowing that came from patient observation. As autumn painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, the rattling of Rattlestar began to carry new undertones, rhythms that felt less like lullabies and more like gentle questions waiting to be answered. Something was shifting in the delicate balance of the world around Seren's Rest, though Mira couldn't yet understand what that change might mean or how it would test the gift that continued to grow within her like a seed reaching toward uncertain light. The questions that autumn had whispered through Rattlestar's gentle rhythm began to find their answers in the patient lessons that followed, though Mira would not understand their full meaning until much later. As winter's grip loosened on Seren's Rest, and the first tentative green shoots pushed through the last patches of snow, Naya began teaching her granddaughter the deeper mysteries of serpent communication. The gift that had seemed so natural in childhood now required cultivation, like tending a garden that grew not in soil, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. Their lessons began before dawn, when the world held its breath between night and day, and the garden snakes were most receptive to gentle contact. Naya would lead Mira to the old wooden bench beside the mint patch, both of them wrapped in woolen shawls against the morning chill. First, you must become very quiet inside, Naya instructed, her weathered hands folded like sleeping birds in her lap. Not just quiet in your thoughts, but quiet in your feelings. The snakes cannot speak over the noise of human worry. This proved far more challenging than Mira had anticipated. Her young mind buzzed with the ordinary concerns of childhood, whether she had remembered to help her mother with the herb drying, if the village children would invite her to their spring games, why her father sometimes paused in his work to stare at the horizon with troubled eyes. These everyday emotions created what Naya called static interference. That made it impossible to perceive the subtle currents flowing through the serpent community. Learning to quiet this internal noise required exercises that felt almost like prayer. Though Naya used gentler words, they would sit in comfortable silence, breathing slowly until their rhythm matched the patient pulse of the earth itself. Mira learned to recognize the difference between her own sharp, quick feelings and the deeper, warmer emotions that belonged to the snakes. Her anxiety felt like raindrops on stone, urgent and scattered. Serpent contentment was like sunlight soaking into earth, steady and profound. Through these careful lessons, Mira began to understand that each snake in their garden possessed a distinct personality that went far beyond simple animal instinct. There was Coil, a young grass snake whose bright curiosity about the human world sometimes led him to investigate the cottage windows with an intensity that made Elena laugh. His emotional signature carried an eagerness that reminded Mira of her own excitement when discovering something wonderful and new. Sage, an older female who preferred the shadowy spaces beneath the lavender bushes, emanated a contemplative quality that felt like the pause between thoughts, deep and reflective. Through patient observation, Mira learned that Sage was something of a philosopher among the garden serpents, her presence carrying the weight of seasons spent in quiet observation of the world's subtle changes. But it was through Whisper that Mira learned the most profound lessons about the nature of serpent consciousness. The ancient snake's emotional presence was like a vast library of feeling, containing layers of memory and experience that stretched back through seasons Mira could barely imagine. Through their wordless communion, she began to understand that snakes carried within themselves the emotional history of their lineage, that Whisper's gentle wisdom was not just her own but the accumulated understanding of countless generations. The connection required tremendous patience from both participants. Some mornings, Mira would sit perfectly still for what felt like hours, waiting for the subtle shift in consciousness that allowed her to perceive Whisper's emotional state. The old snake would coil on her favorite sun-warmed stone, and if Mira quieted herself properly, she could share in the memory warming in Whisper's scales, not pictures, but feelings linked to place and time. A burrow remembered for the way rain drummed above it, like distant thunder, a season remembered as a slow turn from abundance to rest, not frightening but natural, inevitable, rhythmic. Other days, Mira's own excitement or impatience created barriers that no amount of effort could overcome. On those difficult mornings, Naya would remind her that the gift was not something to be grasped or demanded, but rather something to be received with open hands and a quiet heart. "You are not the river," Naya would say softly. "You are the listening left on the bank." As spring deepened into early summer, Mira's reputation in the village began to grow quietly. The way ivy finds a stone wall, without fuss, making itself useful, and then simply becoming part of the landscape. When the baker sent word that something had slipped into his warm cellar, Mira walked there alone, old enough now to test her balance in the world. The snake she found behind the onion crates carried no threat in its emotional signature, only confusion and a longing to return to open air. She opened the cellar window and stood aside, making herself thin as a reed, and waited. The serpent took the invitation gracefully, and later the baker's wife pressed a jar of pickles into Mira's hands with words about bravery that made her smile. Yet even as her abilities grew stronger and more refined, Mira began to sense something shifting in the emotional landscape around Seren's Rest. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like the first discordant note in a familiar song. The underlying peace that had always characterized the serpent community was occasionally punctuated by fainter, more urgent currents, threads of unease that she had never felt before. The rattling of Rattlestar itself seemed to carry a new questioning quality, as if the cosmic serpent were listening for something that had not yet arrived but was certainly coming. The questions that had whispered through Rattlestar's autumn rhythm found their answers in the first traveling merchant who arrived with the spring thaw, his cartwheels catching on the cobblestones as if reluctant to bring the news they carried. He spoke in hushed tones to the village elders beside the old stone well, his words spreading through Seren's Rest like ripples in disturbed water. 3 villages to the north had begun killing snakes on sight. Children were forbidden to play in gardens where serpents might shelter. Ancient agreements between human and serpent communities were crumbling under the weight of stories that grew more terrible with each telling. Mira felt the change before she heard the merchant's words. That morning, as she knelt beside Whisper's sun-warmed stone, the old snake's emotional signature carried tremors of distress that made her faded scales seem to shiver even in the gentle warmth. Through their wordless connection, Mira sensed confusion and a sadness so profound it felt ancient, as if Whisper were mourning not just present danger, but the loss of something that had taken generations to build. The other garden snakes reflected this disturbance in their own ways. Coil's bright curiosity had dimmed to wariness, and Sage had withdrawn deeper into the shadows beneath the lavender, her contemplative presence now tinged with inherited memories of persecution, awakening like dormant seeds touched by fearful rain. The emotional weight of their collective anxiety pressed against Mira's consciousness like a physical burden. She found herself carrying not just her own concerns, but the accumulated distress of every serpent within her expanding range of sensitivity. Some mornings she would wake with tears on her cheeks, having absorbed their nighttime fears while she slept. The gift that had once felt like a gentle stream now threatened to become a flood that might sweep her away entirely. It was during one of these overwhelming mornings that her abilities were truly tested. The village school had always been a place of careful coexistence. Children learned their letters beside windows, where small snakes sometimes sunned themselves on the sills, and no one thought much of it. But fear changes the shape of familiar things. When a young grass snake, drawn by the warmth of the schoolhouse, slipped beneath the door and coiled peacefully under the chalk shelf, a girl's startled cry shattered the morning's quiet like breaking glass. Mira felt the snake's confusion before she saw the teacher reach for the broom with hands that remembered. Old warnings faster than they remembered wisdom. Without thinking, she rose from her bench and placed herself between the broom and the serpent, her small body steady with the calm she had practiced with Naya. She didn't speak to the frightened children first. Instead, she turned inward, toward the bright coil beneath the shelf, offering the gentle reassurance that said, "You are safe here. We understand." The snake's emotional shimmer shifted from sharp alertness to attentive ease, and when Mira suggested they simply open the door and make the outside warmer than the inside, the teacher lowered her broom. They opened the door wide, letting sunlight fall across the threshold like a golden invitation. Mira picked up the chalkboard eraser and warmed it in her hands before setting it in the patch of light, a small beacon of comfort. The snake tasted the air, felt the kindness in the gesture, and slid across the floorboards with liquid grace. When it was gone, the room breathed again, but Mira could feel the lingering questions in the children's minds, the first seeds of the fear that was spreading like a contagion across the land. That evening, Naya found her granddaughter sitting motionless in the garden, overwhelmed by the emotional storm she was experiencing. "Child," the old woman said softly, settling beside Mira with movements careful as prayer, "you cannot carry their fear for them. It will drown you." But Mira found it impossible to separate herself from the waves of distress flowing through both communities. Through whisper, she sensed the debates taking place among the serpent elders, discussions conducted in shared feelings rather than words, ancient wisdom passed from scale to scale about whether to retreat to wilder places or maintain their faith in eventual. Understanding, Naya's weathered hands were gentle as she helped Mira process what she was experiencing. "This has happened before," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "Fear is a contagion that spreads faster than any plague, but understanding is the antidote. That's why our family exists, child. We are the bridge builders, the peace weavers, the ones who remember that different does not mean dangerous." She touched the bone spiral at her throat, its surface worn smooth by decades of worry and hope. The world forgets and remembers, forgets and remembers. Our work is not to force remembering, only to keep a place set for it when it's ready to return. As the days passed, more requests reached their cottage, farmers troubled by snakes in their grain stores, families frightened by serpents seeking shelter in their cellars. Each situation required delicate negotiation, helping both sides understand the other's needs without judgment or force. Mira learned to create alternatives that satisfied everyone. Warm shelters that drew snakes away from human spaces, gentle deterrents that respected both species' right to safety and comfort, but the work was taking its toll. Eleanor found her daughter one evening curled among the mint plants, her small body shaking with exhaustion, her gift having drawn more energy than she possessed. As her mother carried her inside, Mira felt the weight of something larger than her understanding settling over their small family. The rattling of Rattlestar had grown more urgent, no longer a lullaby but a call to action, though what action she could take remained unclear. That night, as fever brought on by emotional overload finally broke with the dawn, Mira understood with crystalline clarity that her childhood was ending. The gift that had seemed so natural and gentle was calling her to step into a role she had never sought but could not refuse. The serpent war spreading across the land would not be fought with weapons, but with understanding, and she was perhaps the only person in their corner of the world who could speak both languages fluently enough to serve as translator in the delicate negotiations that lay ahead. The fever that broke with dawn left, Mira changed in ways that went deeper than the simple return of physical strength. As she lay listening to her mother's gentle movements in the kitchen below and feeling Whisper's familiar presence anchoring the garden's peace, she understood that the girl who had collapsed among the mint plants would not be the one who rose to face what was coming. The gift that had once felt like a gentle companion now pressed against her consciousness with the urgency of a calling that could no longer wait for her to grow into it. Through the window, Rattlestar's morning fade seemed to whisper, that childhood was a luxury the world could no longer afford her. Elena noticed the change immediately when Mira descended the stairs 3 days later. Her daughter moved with a new deliberateness, as if each step were weighted with purpose she had not possessed before. When Mira spoke, her words carried the measured cadence of someone who understood that speech could heal or harm, and must therefore be chosen with the care of a gardener, selecting seeds for the most important harvest. "The fear is spreading faster than we thought," Mira told her parents over breakfast, her small hands steady around her cup of chamomile tea. "I can feel it in the serpents 3 villages away now, but leaving won't solve the real problem. The fear will follow them wherever they go." She paused. And in that silence, Eleanor heard the echo of Naya's voice, the same tone of gentle authority that came from carrying knowledge too large for one person to hold alone. "I need to learn how to teach others what I know. People are afraid because they've forgotten how to see, and the serpents are withdrawing because they've forgotten that some humans still remember how to listen." The first test of this new resolve came that very afternoon, when Jory the grainkeeper arrived at their cottage door, with worry creasing his weathered face. Something had found warmth in the heart of his storehouse, he explained, and the grain sacks near the wall had shifted into what looked like a breathing pile. Mira walked with him through the village, feeling the familiar tingle of serpent consciousness at the edge of her awareness. The young male snake inside carried no malice in his emotional signature, only the determined patience of a creature, riding out the cold. Standing under the storehouse rafters, Mira reached out with the gentle reassurance that had become second nature. Through their wordless connection, she understood his simple need for shelter, his confusion at the human distress his presence had caused. "He's not threatening your grain," she told Jory softly. "He's just trying to stay warm until the weather turns." Together, they gathered old terracotta tiles from behind the building, warming them in the afternoon sun, before lining a shallow trench outside the storehouse. Then Mira opened the door and waited, heart quiet, mind quiet, offering the simple invitation of a better option. The snake slid out like a ribbon, choosing comfort over conflict. Jory watched with wonder at how uncomplicated mercy could be when fear stepped aside to make room for understanding. Word spread through Seren's Rest the way it always did, through hands passing bread and nods at the well. Elena began packing small sandwiches into Mira's satchel each morning, bread and soft cheese wrapped in cloth, understanding that listening took strength. Thomas, usually quiet as stones, started building small shelters in likely corners of the village, tidy heaps of warm rocks behind the bakery, a shaded trough near the school's back wall, a spiral of bricks by the mill where sun pooled. He never announced these gestures, simply arranged the world so that it could choose peace more easily. Yet the emotional weight of carrying both communities' fears pressed against Mira's consciousness like a constant ache. She found herself absorbing not just her own concerns, but the accumulated distress of every serpent within her expanding range of sensitivity. Some mornings she would wake with tears on her cheeks, having absorbed their nighttime anxieties while she slept. The gift that had once felt like a gentle stream now threatened to become a flood that might sweep her away entirely. It was Naya who taught her the crucial difference between compassion and possession. "You cannot carry their fear for them," the old woman said gently, settling beside Mira in the garden with movements careful as prayer. "It will drown you. Imagine your chest as a window, not a storage room. You can love their feelings without keeping them." She showed Mira a simple rhythm of breath to match the earth's patience, and a 4-note hum she called an old lullaby for wild hearts. "When panic comes, sing to yourself first, then sing to the moment." The lessons proved essential when Mira encountered the herbalist's new apprentice one evening outside the apothecary. Finn possessed his own gift, though it was different from hers. Where she could sense emotions, he could perceive the physical and spiritual health of living things. His hands seemed to carry natural healing energy, and he had an intuitive understanding of which herbs could soothe which ailments. When he first saw her surrounded by the garden snakes, who regarded her as their beloved interpreter, he felt no fear, only wonder and immediate recognition. Most importantly, he could sense the strain that her gift placed on her spirit. The way carrying the emotions of two communities was slowly draining her life force. Without words, he began to help, offering her a steaming cup that smelled like fields after rain. "It steadies the heart without making it heavy," he said, his voice low enough to keep the dusk intact. His presence was like a gentle filter, helping her separate her own feelings from those she carried for others. As Mira sat on the apothecary steps, feeling warmth travel through her fingers to the overworked places inside, she sensed something shifting in the cosmic rhythm above. The rattling of Rattlestar seemed to approve, its ancient music finding a new harmony. She did not yet know that Finn's gift would braid with hers in ways that would transform both their abilities, only that sitting there felt like exhaling after holding a breath too long. The serpent war spreading across the land would require every ally they could find, and the stars had just sent her the first. When she returned home that night, Naya was waiting with the window open to catch the first starlight. "The world is sending helpers," the old woman said, not looking away from the sky. "It does that when we stop pretending we can carry it alone." Mira stood beside her, the evening's peace lingering in her heart, and felt the day's weight shift towards something kinder. Somewhere beyond the roofs, the river made its easy sound, and the cosmic serpent above arranged its quiet scales into a pattern she had not seen before. A gentle crossing, two paths choosing to walk side by side. The pattern Mira had glimpsed in Rattlestar's arrangement proved prophetic in ways that unfolded like morning glory flowers opening to the sun. In the nights that followed their first meeting on the apothecary steps, Finn became a quiet constant, arriving with the dusk the way lamplight shows up at windows just when the room remembers it is growing dark. He never crowded the space around her gift, moving gently as though approaching a wild bird, offering small practical kindnesses that felt like doorways instead of demands. He brought a slender twig of willow for tea, explaining how its bitterness steadies systems that have been singing too loudly. He pressed a smooth river stone into her palm, dark and palm-sized, its surface rubbed with beeswax and thyme so the scent could return her to herself when the noise of other hearts grew too insistent. "Hold this when you listen," he said, the corner of his mouth soft with understanding. "Let your body remember where you end." Their first true collaboration began when they encountered Mrs. Thorne weeping beside her vegetable garden, a hoe clutched in her trembling hands. She had discovered a family of snakes sheltering beneath her bean trellises and found herself paralyzed between old stories that warned of danger and newer memories of Mira's gentle interventions throughout the village. "I don't want to hurt them," she whispered, her voice breaking like autumn leaves. "But I can't stop shaking when I see them there." Mira knelt beside the bean plants, extending her consciousness toward the small family group with the careful gentleness she had learned from Naya. Through their wordless connection, she sensed their confusion and distress. They had chosen this sheltered spot not from any desire to trouble the humans, but because the rich soil held warmth longer than the surrounding ground, and the mother snake was preparing to lay eggs that would need steady temperatures to develop properly. Their emotional signature carried no aggression, only the ancient drive to nurture new life in the safest place they could find. While Mira communicated with the serpents, Finn placed his hands gently on Mrs. Thorne's shoulders, his healing touch working to ease the physical manifestations of her fear. Under his influence, her breathing deepened and the rigid tension in her muscles began to release. "They're not here to harm," he said softly, his voice carrying the same soothing quality as his touch. "They're here to create. There's a mother who needs this warmth for her young ones." Where Mira's gift allowed her to sense the emotional turmoil that fear created in both communities, Finn's abilities could perceive the deeper wounds that sustained such fear. He saw the spiritual exhaustion that came from living in constant vigilance, the way mistrust created actual physical tension that made peaceful coexistence nearly impossible. His hands, though calloused from working with roots and leaves, carried natural healing energy, and he understood which herbs could soothe an inflamed spirit as instinctively as he knew which ones could mend a broken bone. Together, they created a solution that honored everyone's requirements. They built a small shelter of warm stones and old pottery shards in the unused corner of Mrs. Thorne's garden, positioning it to catch the morning sun while remaining sheltered from afternoon winds. Mira offered the serpent family this alternative, with the gentle suggestion that it might serve their needs even better than the bean trellis, while Finn helped Mrs. Thorne understand that her garden was large enough to hold both her vegetables and their quiet neighbors. This pattern of collaborative healing began to repeat itself. Throughout Seren's rest in the surrounding farms, Finn taught Mira to create boundaries that protected her sensitive spirit without dulling her empathy. "Your heart is a sponge," he observed one evening as they walked the quiet paths on the village edge. "It absorbs everything. But a sponge needs wringing out, or it becomes heavy and useless." He showed her breathing exercises that helped her consciously release emotional residue, teaching her to visualize others' feelings as mist passing through her like transient clouds, acknowledged but not held. He brewed special teas for her, mixtures of lemon balm for calm, valerian root for deep sleep, and a touch of wild rose to mend the heart's tender edges. His presence was like a gentle filter, helping her separate her own feelings from those she carried for others. When the emotional weight of carrying two communities' fears threatened to overwhelm her sensitive nature, his healing touch could restore her balance. Naya watched these new patterns forming and nodded as if a promise she'd made long ago had finally kept itself. She began adding a new layer to Mira's training, teaching her to imagine 3 baskets. "The first is yours, the second belongs to whoever you're with, and the third is for the world. When feelings rise, place them where they belong. Visit the second, glance at the third, but live in the first." Their reputation grew quietly, through grateful smiles and peaceful gardens, through children who no longer ran screaming when they glimpsed a snake, through farmers who found ways to share their land without surrendering their livelihoods. Elena began packing larger lunches, understanding that her daughter's work now extended far beyond their own village boundaries. Thomas expanded his shelter-building project, creating warming stations and safe passages that helped serpents navigate human spaces without causing alarm. As their working relationship deepened, so did their personal bond. Their evening walks became rituals of mutual restoration, processing the day's emotional residue together under the gentle rattling of Rattlestar. One particularly clear night, as they sat beside the old stone well where carved serpents wound around the rim in an endless spiral, Finn took her hand with the same gentle reverence he brought to his healing work. "I think we were meant to find each other," he said softly, his thumb tracing circles on her palm that seemed to ease tensions she hadn't realized she was carrying. Not just for the work, but for this. For being able to rest in someone who understands the weight of caring so much. Through Whisper's ancient wisdom, Mira understood that some connections transcended individual lifetimes, that souls sometimes found each other across vast distances to fulfill purposes too large for any single heart to hold. Their love was not separate from their calling, but an essential part of it, the foundation that would allow them to build something lasting in a world that had forgotten how to trust. The gentle circles Finn had traced on her palm the night before seemed to echo through the days that followed, creating ripples of understanding that spread outward like warm light through still water. Their connection had named itself quietly, without ceremony, the way morning arrives, not announced but simply present when the world is ready to receive it. With this new foundation beneath them, their work began to take on deeper dimensions, as if love itself had become another tool for building bridges between the human and serpent worlds. Finn's healing gift revealed new facets when braided together with Mira's empathic abilities. Where she could sense the emotional turbulence that fear created in both communities, he could perceive the physical manifestations of that distress, the way mistrust created actual tension in human muscles, the stress responses that made peaceful coexistence nearly impossible. His hands, though calloused from working with roots and leaves, carried a natural healing energy that seemed to create space for understanding to take root, their first true collaboration as partners, rather than simply allies, came when the village baker sent word that something had taken residence in his warm cellar. Mira descended the stone steps with Finn beside her, feeling the familiar tingle of serpent consciousness at the edge of her awareness. The young snake coiled among the flour sacks carried no malice in his emotional signature, only confusion and the simple desire for shelter from the early autumn chill. But the baker's fear was equally real, his livelihood threatened by the presence of a creature he had been taught to see as dangerous. Rather than simply communicating with the snake as she had done before, Mira found herself becoming a translator in the truest sense. She helped the baker understand not just that the serpent meant no harm, but why it had chosen this particular refuge, the way the stone walls held warmth long after the ovens cooled, the sense of safety that enclosed spaces provided for a creature whose survival depended on regulating its body temperature. Through her gift, she shared just a whisper of the snake's contentment, the peaceful drowsiness that came from finding perfect warmth after cold uncertainty. Finn worked simultaneously to ease the physical tension that fear had created in the baker's shoulders and hands, his touch somehow communicating that safety was possible. That different did not necessarily mean dangerous. Together they created a solution that honored both needs, a warm shelter constructed from old bricks and pottery shards, positioned to catch the morning sun while remaining safely away from food storage. The snake accepted this alternative with the dignity of ancient royalty, and the baker found his fear transformed into something closer to respectful coexistence. Word of their collaborative approach spread through Seren's rest in the gentle way that good news travels, through grateful smiles and peaceful gardens, through children who no longer ran screaming when they glimpsed a serpent sunning itself on warm stones. Elena began packing larger lunches, understanding that her daughter's calling now extended beyond their own cottage walls. Thomas expanded his quiet shelter-building project, creating warming stations throughout the village that offered serpents alternatives to human spaces while respecting both species' need for safety. They began holding informal gatherings in the apothecary courtyard, though no one called them meetings. People simply appeared as dusk settled over the village, drawn by the scent of Finn's herbal teas and the promise of understanding that seemed to radiate from their joined presence. Mira learned to modulate her gift, like adjusting the volume of a lullaby, sharing just enough of serpent consciousness to foster empathy without overwhelming sensitive human minds. With children, she offered only the lightest brush of serpent curiosity, the gentle tickle of tasting air, the simple contentment of warming scales on sun-heated stone. "He's not angry," she would say, her voice soft as falling snow. "He's just a little bit shy, like you might be when meeting someone new." The children would giggle at these glimpses into serpent experience, their natural wonder overcoming inherited fears. With adults, she shared deeper threads of serpent patience and ancient wisdom, thick enough to hold onto when old stories stirred their blood toward violence. She learned to create what Naya called emotional doorways, brief openings that allowed humans to experience the world through serpent senses without losing themselves in the process. These moments of connection often transformed fear into wonder, creating advocates who could continue the work of building understanding in their own families and neighborhoods. Finn developed herbal preparations that complemented Mira's emotional work, teas that calmed the physical manifestations of fear, making it easier for people to approach serpents without the rigid tension that often triggered defensive responses. He also created healing balms for serpents who had been injured by frightened humans. His touch somehow communicating across species boundaries that help was available without threat. Their cottage became an unofficial healing center, though it bore no formal name or structure. Farmers arrived seeking help with grain stores that serpents had claimed for winter shelter. Mothers came with children who had developed such intense snake phobia that they refused to play in their own gardens. An elderly man appeared one morning, seeking to make amends for accidentally injuring a serpent while clearing his garden path. Each situation required delicate negotiation and creative problem-solving. But Mira found that her role was evolving from simply carrying others' emotions to actively facilitating understanding between different ways of experiencing the world. She was learning the art of translation, not just between species, but between different forms of consciousness entirely. As their reputation grew, Naya watched with eyes that held both pride and gentle concern. "The gift is outgrowing our small garden," she observed one evening, as they sat watching Rattlestar emerge in the darkening sky. Through Whisper's ancient presence, Mira sensed that larger purposes were stirring, carried on winds that brought news of conflicts beyond their peaceful village. But for now, in this gentle hour, it was enough to sit beside the ones she loved most, feeling the cosmic serpent above arrange its quiet scales into patterns that spoke of love, made manifest in service to understanding. The rattling of the stars had become a lullaby of completion and new beginning, promising that every bridge built in love would hold, no matter what storms might come to test its strength. The promises whispered in starlight and sealed with gentle touch began to manifest in ways that felt as natural as morning following night, each development flowing from the last like water, finding its inevitable course toward the sea. In the days following their quiet declaration of love beside the ancient well, Mira and Finn discovered that their joined purpose had created something larger than either could have achieved alone, a sanctuary that drew seekers not through proclamation, but through the simple magnetism of peace made visible. Their cottage, once a private haven where Elena's herb garden met the cobblestones of Seren's Rest, began to hum with a different energy. Visitors arrived not in great numbers, but in a steady, gentle stream. Farmers seeking counsel about grain stores where serpents had made winter homes, mothers bringing children whose nightmares had been shaped by old stories of danger, elderly folk who remembered gentler times and wondered if such peace might be possible again. Each person carried their own small portion of the larger fear that was spreading through distant lands. But here, in the warmth of Elena's kitchen and the patient presence of her daughter's gift, those fears found space to transform into something more manageable. Finn's healing abilities revealed new dimensions when braided together with Mira's empathic understanding. Where she could sense the emotional turbulence that fear created in both human and serpent communities, he could perceive the physical manifestations of that distress, the way mistrust created actual tension in human muscles, the stress responses that made peaceful coexistence nearly impossible. His hands, calloused from working with roots and leaves, seemed to carry a natural healing energy that created space for understanding to take root in hearts that had been closed by inherited anxieties. Their collaborative approach began to create small miracles of transformation. When the village weaver arrived with hands that shook whenever she glimpsed movement in her yarn basket, Mira helped her understand that the small snake sheltering there carried no malice, only the simple desire for warmth and the familiar scent of natural fibers. Through her gift, she shared just a whisper of the serpent's contentment, the peaceful drowsiness that came from finding perfect shelter after uncertain wandering. Finn worked simultaneously to ease the physical tension that fear had created in the weaver's shoulders and hands, his touch somehow communicating that safety was possible. That different did not necessarily mean dangerous. As their reputation spread through the gentle channels of gratitude and word of mouth, Thomas began expanding his quiet shelter-building project throughout the village and surrounding farms. He created warming stations from old pottery and river stones, positioned to catch morning sun while remaining safely away from human activity. These simple structures offered serpents alternatives to human spaces, while respecting both species' need for safety and comfort. Helena, understanding that her daughter's calling now extended beyond their cottage walls, began packing larger lunches and preparing guest spaces for visitors who traveled from increasingly distant places. The need for a larger space became apparent, not through crisis but through abundance too, many seeking hearts for their small kitchen table to accommodate comfortably. With the quiet support of the village elders, who had long respected Naya's wisdom and now saw its flowering in Mira, they began preparing a sun-drenched structure on the edge of Seren's Rest, near the winding river that had always been a source of peace. The building rose slowly, with help from neighbors who understood they were creating something precious. Wide windows to let in healing light, open courtyards where serpents could bask undisturbed, and a special garden cultivated with plants known to attract and soothe local serpent species. Their days developed a rhythm that felt like a gentle liturgy of service. Mornings began with Mira spending quiet time in the serpent garden, renewing her connection with Whisper and the other elders, grounding herself in their ancient patience before facing the day's human anxieties. She discovered that this daily ritual not only fortified her spirit, but also expanded her reach. Her connection to serpents, once limited to their immediate vicinity, began to stretch further, a subtle network of awareness that allowed her to sense emotional shifts in serpent communities across greater distances. Finn found that his healing abilities were enhanced when working in harmony with Mira's empathic insights. Understanding the emotional root of a physical ailment, gleaned through her gentle perceptions, allowed him to select herbs and apply therapies with unprecedented precision. A human heart eased by understanding proved far more receptive to physical healing, and together they discovered that true wellness was never just about the body or the mind, but about the intricate dance between them. Their love deepened with their shared purpose, becoming not separate from their calling, but an essential part of it. Finn's steady presence was the unwavering anchor that allowed Mira to venture further into the sometimes overwhelming currents of empathy without losing herself in the process. Their relationship was built not on grand gestures, but on countless small acts of mutual support. A cup of calming tea offered at precisely the right moment, a silent walk by the river when words would have been too much, the simple comfort of hands that understood each other's work. Naya, growing lighter in her earthly body as her spirit prepared for larger journeys, spent peaceful afternoons watching from a sun-warmed bench in the center's garden. Her eyes, though dimmed by age, missed nothing. The way Mira's hand instinctively reached for Finn's when difficult cases weighed heavily, the quiet reverence in their interactions with both humans and serpents, the unwavering belief in the possibility of peace that radiated from their joined presence. As autumn painted the world in shades of gold and amber, the cosmic serpent above seemed to smile, its scales arranging themselves in patterns that spoke not of war, but of the slow, patient unfolding of harmony. The rattling of Rattlestar had evolved into something like a lullaby of completion and new beginning, promising that every bridge built in love would hold. No matter what storms might come to test its strength, the lullaby of completion and new beginning that had whispered through Rattlestar's gentle arrangement seemed to deepen in the nights that followed, as if the cosmic serpent above were preparing to share secrets that had been held in starlight for countless generations. Mira found herself drawn to the garden at hours when the boundary between day and night grew thin, when the familiar world seemed to breathe with possibilities that daylight made too shy to show themselves. It was during one such twilight hour, as autumn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, that whisper came to her not with movement, but with presence, a soft gathering of attention that felt like the hush that falls when a sacred story is about to begin. The old serpent lay coiled in her favorite spiral on the sun-warmed stone, her scales now so faded they seemed to hold moonlight even in the evening's gentle glow. As Mira settled beside her, she felt the familiar tingle of serpent consciousness at the edge of her awareness. But tonight it carried a different quality, deeper, wider. Like standing at the shore of an ocean, she had only glimpsed in streams and ponds. Finn, sensing the shift in the evening's rhythm, brought a soft blanket and settled nearby, his healing presence creating a quiet anchor while remaining respectfully distant from whatever was about to unfold. The joining began as gently as sleep, with a single note that Mira felt in the hollow behind her heart and the bones of her face. It was not strange or frightening, but familiar in the way that childhood lullabies remain familiar even when their words are forgotten. Comfort first, meaning flowing softly after. Through Whisper's ancient consciousness, she felt herself welcomed into what could only be described as a gathering of minds that transcended individual existence, a network of serpent wisdom that stretched not just across the known lands but backward through time itself, carrying memories that belonged to no single creature but to the species as a whole. She experienced the felt life of countless generations, arriving in layers that did not compete but harmonized like voices in a choir that had been singing the same gentle song since the world was young. She tasted the patience of burrows and the mathematics of sunlight, the way heat travels through rock in careful spirals, how safety feels to a body that moves close to the earth and finds wisdom in stillness. Through this vast communion, she felt the reverent humor with which serpents regard the small creatures who build fires, to keep warm and call that miracle their own. The ancient tenderness that persists even when the world forgets to return such love. The memories that flowed through her carried the weight of deep history. She experienced the time when humans and serpents moved through the world as partners rather than strangers, when gifts like hers were common and celebrated, when fear had not yet built walls between species that had once shared the same sun-warmed stones. She felt the slow erosion of that understanding, the gradual replacement of wisdom with superstition, and most powerfully, the patient hope that serpents had maintained through generations of misunderstanding. Carrying the memory of harmony like a seed, waiting for the right season to bloom. Within this vast network of consciousness, her own small life appeared not as the center of some cosmic drama, but as one slender thread among many, made strong by its connection to the greater weaving. She recognized Naya's younger self as a bright, steady presence in a season when the world had nearly forgotten how to listen, and sensed other human hearts scattered across distant lands. souls tuned to birds, to rivers, to trees that speak in the deep vowels of sap and weather. They were not rare, she understood with sudden clarity. They were simply quiet, working in their own gardens and villages, building bridges that connected the human world to the older, deeper wisdom that runs through all living things. When the serpent network turned toward future rather than memory, Mira felt no prophecy or urgent demand for action, only the gentle recognition of pattern. She glimpsed the possibility that was slowly unfolding across the earth, a world where the ancient partnership could be restored, where her gift was not unique, but part of a larger awakening of empathic abilities in humanity. It would not come through dramatic transformation, but through countless small acts of understanding, quiet moments of connection, gentle bridges built one heart at a time, until the web of compassion grew strong enough to hold the whole world in its embrace. The experience left her profoundly changed, filled with a sense of purpose that transcended her individual life, while somehow making that life feel more precious, more connected to the vast tapestry of existence. She understood now that her role was not just to maintain peace in Seren's Rest, but to help prepare the way for a larger transformation that was already beginning to unfold in hidden places across the earth. The rattling of Rattlestar, which had once been her private lullaby, now revealed itself as part of a cosmic symphony, a universal empathy that resonated with the fundamental harmony underlying all apparent conflict. As the mystical communion gently released her back to her individual consciousness, Mira found Finn waiting with a cup of steaming tea that smelled like meadows after rain, his steady presence a perfect bridge between the cosmic and the intimate. He didn't ask what she had experienced, understanding somehow that some journeys require time to translate into words. Instead, he simply offered the warmth of human companionship, the simple blessing of being understood, without explanation. Naya appeared in the garden as the first stars began to show themselves, her weathered face holding the kind of knowing that comes from having walked similar paths in her own youth. "The world has remembered its song through you, child," she whispered, settling beside them with movements careful as prayer, "and now it asks you to sing it for others." Her words carried no pressure, only recognition of a calling that had always been present, waiting for the right moment to reveal its full dimensions. In the days that followed, the knowing settled into their work, like sunlight soaking into earth, creating changes that felt both inevitable and gentle. Mira began adding quiet moments to her morning ritual, 2 breaths for the near work of their village and center, 2 for the far work of distant communities seeking help, and 1 for the beyond work of the vast network of consciousness she had touched. Their teaching evolved to include simple practices that helped visitors recognize their own capacity for empathic connection, creating ripples of understanding that would spread far beyond Seren's Rest. The cosmic serpent above seemed to smile as it arranged its quiet scales into new patterns, and the rattling of the stars became a lullaby that spoke not of endings, but of eternal beginning, promising that every bridge built in love would hold, no matter what storms might come to test its strength. Somewhere in the space between heartbeats, where all conflicts resolve into harmony, the ancient song of unity continued to play, and those who had learned to listen carried its melody forward into a world that was slowly, gently, remembering how to sing along. The ancient song that had whispered through the serpent network began to manifest in the world with the gentle inevitability of spring following winter, each new development flowing naturally from what had come before like water, finding its destined course toward the sea. In the days following Mira's profound communion with the cosmic consciousness, their work began to expand beyond Seren's Rest, not through proclamation or urgent mission, but through the quiet magnetism of peace made visible, carried forward by hearts that had been touched and transformed. The first sign of this expansion came with the potter from the hill country, a weathered woman named Kira, whose hands bore the permanent stains of clay, and whose eyes held the particular uncertainty of someone who had learned to doubt her own gentle instincts. She arrived on a morning when autumn mist clung to the river like whispered secrets, carrying with her a story that would become familiar in the months ahead. Serpents had begun appearing in her workshop, coiling themselves in the cool hollows of her unfired bowls, as if recognizing something sacred in the shaped earth. She had never harmed them, only watched with reverent confusion as her clay vessels became temporary homes. But the other potters in her village had begun to whisper warnings that made her question the kindness she felt, toward these unexpected visitors. Mira walked through Kira's carefully arranged workspace, feeling the soft thread of emotion that trailed behind the woman's measured words. Through her expanded sensitivity, she sensed not fear but a deep hesitation, born from living too long among people who had taught her to mistrust the gentleness of her own heart. Together they created warming stations from old pottery shards and river stones, positioning them to catch the morning sun while remaining safely away from the delicate work of shaping clay. Finn prepared a tea that steadied the tremor in Kira's hands, and by afternoon her bowls sat where they belonged, while the serpents found comfort in spaces designed to welcome rather than merely tolerate their presence. Word of their approach spread through the gentle channels of gratitude and practical success, carried by traders and traveling healers who had witnessed the transformation of fear into understanding. A scholar arrived next, his saddlebags heavy with rolled maps that smelled of distant places and patient research. He had been documenting communities where similar work was quietly unfolding, coastal villages where old women could calm storms by speaking with the deeper currents, mountain settlements where children learned to ask permission from the forest before gathering herbs, river towns where the boundary between human consciousness and the ancient wisdom of flowing water had grown thin enough to allow meaningful exchange. His maps revealed what Mira's cosmic experience had promised, that their work in Seren's Rest was not isolated, but part of a larger awakening that was spreading across the known world like morning light touching distant peaks. Small symbols marked places where listening had altered the shape of ordinary life, where gifts like hers were quietly mending the ancient rifts between human and natural worlds. When he departed, he left the maps behind, tied with twine and sealed with beeswax like a promise that the network of understanding would continue to grow. Children began arriving too, their abilities like shy creatures emerging from the edges of their awareness. A quiet boy from the marshlands, who felt the moods of eels as a low thrum in his forearms, their contentment or distress singing through his bones like a barometer of the water's health. A girl named Lyra, whose ears caught the hesitation in birdsong before storms, who would look up with sudden alertness, a heartbeat, before the first wind reached the trees. Mira taught them not to gather their gifts like treasures to be hoarded, but to let their sensitivity become a way of making room in the world. 2 deep breaths before acting, a cup of water placed on a doorstep for thirsty creatures, a whispered apology spoken even when no one else could hear. Their healing center evolved to accommodate this growing community of practice, expanding not through grand construction, but through the kind of organic growth that happens when need meets loving attention. Thomas, with his quiet understanding of practical requirements, began crafting additional spaces that could house visitors while maintaining the delicate balance of energies that made their work possible. Eleanor's maternal instincts embraced this chosen family, developing systems for feeding and caring for guests who arrived exhausted from long journeys, and the emotional weight of their callings. Finn discovered that his healing abilities were enhanced when working alongside others who shared similar sensitivities. The herbs he prepared for Mira's empathic work proved equally effective for visitors whose gifts operated in different frequencies. Teas that grounded those who worked with air and sky, salves that protected the sensitive skin of people who spent long hours in direct contact with wild creatures, tinctures that helped maintain clarity when channeling the consciousness of very different forms of life. Most importantly, they began to teach not just the specific techniques of their individual gifts, but the underlying attitudes that made such work possible. They emphasized the importance of emotional boundaries, of listening without absorbing, of offering choices rather than imposing solutions. They taught the power of gentle observation, of allowing solutions to emerge from shared understanding rather than forced compromise. Their students, healers, storytellers, quiet community leaders, returned to their homes carrying not just methods, but a renewed sense of possibility. Letters began to arrive, tied with grass or sealed with beeswax, stamped with whatever symbol a village favored, a fish, a sheaf of grain, a crescent moon. They contained small accounts of practice and discovery. A miller who found that tapping his floorboards 3 times before entering his storehouse gave snakes time to slip into the sun-warmed shelter he had built beside the door. A school where children painted gentle pictures of the eye, creatures who shared their village, and posted them near cellar entrances as reminders that fear forgets faces, but love remembers hearts, Mira answered. each letter with gratitude and one simple question, "What have you noticed?" and found that people shared more when she asked for observation rather than success. These correspondences began to weave themselves into a network of quiet support, connecting communities across vast distances through shared commitment to understanding rather than conquest. Naya, her earthly form growing lighter as her spirit prepared for larger journeys, spent peaceful afternoons in the center's sun-drenched courtyard, watching this flowering of collaborative healing with eyes that held both wonder and deep recognition. One evening, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, she called Mira to her favorite bench and, without ceremony, lifted the bone spiral from her own throat and placed it gently in her granddaughter's waiting hands. "For when you speak in rooms I won't enter," she said softly, her weathered fingers tracing the pendant's smooth curves one final time. The gesture carried no weight of burden, only the quiet passing of a torch that had been carried through generations of bridge builders and peace weavers. Mira felt the spiral's warmth against her palm and understood that she now held not just a family heirloom, but a symbol of the ancient calling that connected her work to something far larger than individual purpose. As winter approached and the cosmic serpent above arranged its scales in patterns that spoke of networks and connections, Mira felt a deep contentment settling in her bones. The gift that had once seemed like a solitary burden now revealed itself as one voice in a growing chorus, part of a universal song that was being remembered and shared across the earth. The rattling of Rattlestar had evolved into something like a celestial celebration, marking the rhythm of a world slowly remembering how to sing in harmony with itself. In the space between heartbeats, where all conflicts resolve into understanding, she could hear the ancient melody of unity growing stronger, carried forward by countless hearts that had learned to listen with love instead of fear. The serpent war that had once seemed so urgent now revealed itself as something gentler and more profound, not a battle to be won, but a harmony to be restored. One patient breath at a time, the gentle celebration that had whispered through Rattlestar's arrangement began to falter as winter settled over their expanding network like a blanket woven from frost and distant worry. The letters that arrived now carried different weight. Some still brought small joys about gardens, where children and serpents shared sunlight without fear, but others came tied with darker thread. Their wax seals cracked, as if they had trembled through long cold journeys. Mira felt the shift before she read the words, a tightening in the cosmic rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, a discordant note threading through the harmony they had worked so patiently to build. The message that changed everything arrived on the shortest day of winter, carried by a messenger whose horse stamped restlessly in the courtyard, as if sensing the emotional weight of the news it bore. The paper smelled faintly of smoke and river mud, and the careful script told a story that Mira had always known might come, but had hoped never would. In a valley 3 days' ride north, a child reaching beneath a drying board to retrieve a dropped wooden toy had disturbed a venomous serpent seeking shelter from the cold. The bite had been swift, the venom faster than any healing herb, and by sunset the child was gone, leaving behind a grief so vast it had transformed an entire region's careful peace into something sharp and purposeful and deadly. The grief-mad rage that followed was unlike anything in Mira's experience. Through the serpent network, she felt the terror of creatures who had lived peacefully alongside humans for generations, now hunted in ditches and hedgerows with fire and blade. Villages that had maintained delicate coexistence for countless seasons were organizing systematic extermination, their inherited fears awakened by fresh tragedy. The cry, "No more children lost," echoed through distant hills, drowning out any voice that might speak of understanding or measured response. Mira felt the anguish of both sides with an intensity that threatened to shatter the careful boundaries she had learned to maintain. The human grief was a sharp, burning pain, the absolute desolation of parents whose future had been torn away, the ancient terror of a species that had forgotten its partnership with the natural world and now saw only threat. Simultaneously, she absorbed the serpent's bewilderment and panic, their desperate confusion at being hunted in places where they had once been welcomed, their collective cry of fear that blurred individual voices into one overwhelming wave of despair. For the first time since her gift had fully awakened, Mira found herself drowning in emotions too vast for any single heart to contain. The pain flowed through her like a river in flood, sweeping away the careful practices Naya had taught her, overwhelming the gentle boundaries that had once felt as natural as breathing. She collapsed in the center's courtyard. Her consciousness scattered across the network of serpent awareness, unable to separate her own small self from the vast chorus of suffering that pressed against her spirit like a physical weight. Finn found her there as evening shadows lengthened, her body shaking with fever, born not of illness but of carrying more sorrow than human flesh was meant to hold. For 3 days she drifted between waking and sleeping, her spirit caught somewhere in the space between her individual awareness and the cosmic web of consciousness that cried out in shared anguish. He brewed the strongest calming teas, cooled her burning forehead with river water, and sang the 4-note hum that Naya had taught them both. But still her body burned with borrowed pain that threatened to consume her entirely. It was Whisper who guided her back from the edge of dissolution, appearing not in the physical world, but in the fevered landscape of her dreams. The old serpent's presence was like a lighthouse in a storm, steady and unwavering, despite the chaos swirling around them. Through their wordless connection, Whisper shared an image that settled into Mira's consciousness like a seed finding fertile ground, a river swollen with spring rain, threatening to burst its banks and flood the surrounding countryside. In the dream vision, Whisper showed her 2 responses to the raging water. The first was to build walls, to resist the flow with barriers that would either hold or be swept away entirely. The second was to understand the river's nature, to guide its energy into channels that could contain its power without breaking its essential movement. You cannot stop the flood, Whisper's presence conveyed without words, but you can help it find a path that nourishes rather than destroys. The ancient serpent's wisdom carried layers of meaning that unfolded slowly in Mira's fevered consciousness. She began to understand that her role was not to absorb the pain of others, but to become a clear channel through which understanding could flow, like a window rather than a storage room, as Naya had once said, transparent enough to let light pass through without being darkened by what it carried. The suffering she had been trying to hold was meant to move through her, to be witnessed and acknowledged and transformed, not hoarded in her heart until it poisoned her spirit. When the fever finally broke on the 4th morning, Mira woke with a clarity that felt both familiar and entirely new. The bone spiral at her throat no longer vibrated with urgent distress, but held a steady, gentle warmth that spoke of balance restored. Finn, who had maintained his vigil with the patient devotion of someone who understood that love sometimes means simply bearing witness, helped her sit up slowly, offering tea that tasted like meadows after rain and the promise of spring returning to frozen ground. As strength gradually returned to her limbs, Mira began to formulate a different approach to the crisis that had nearly destroyed her. Rather than rushing toward the distant conflict with the urgency her younger self might have felt, she understood now that lasting resolution required patience, collaboration, and the kind of deep work that could not be accomplished by any single person, no matter how gifted. The network they had been building, healers and bridge builders scattered across many communities, would need to carry this burden together, each contributing their own small part to a larger healing that might take seasons or years to fully unfold. She began writing letters not to demand immediate action, but to ask gentle questions, to share what she had learned about creating space for grief to transform itself into wisdom rather than vengeance. Her correspondence carried no dramatic solutions, but offered practical techniques for helping communities process trauma without perpetuating cycles of fear and retaliation. Most importantly, she began preparing others to carry this work forward when she could not be present herself, understanding finally that the greatest gift she could offer was not her individual abilities, but the knowledge of how to nurture similar gifts in others. As winter's grip began to loosen and the first tentative signs of spring appeared in their garden, the rattling of Rattlestar resumed its gentle rhythm. No longer a celebration, but something deeper, a cosmic exhale, the sound of tension releasing into trust. The serpent war that had once seemed so urgent now revealed itself as part of a larger pattern, a necessary crisis that would either break the fragile bonds between species or forge them into something stronger than they had ever been before. In the quiet hours before dawn, Mira could feel the ancient song of unity growing stronger, carried not by dramatic gestures, but by countless small acts of understanding. Quiet bridges built one heart at a time until the web of compassion grew strong enough to hold even the deepest conflicts in its gentle embrace. The gentle wisdom that had emerged from Whisper's fevered guidance settled into Mira's consciousness like morning light, finding its way through curtains, illuminating a path that required not the urgent intervention her younger self might have attempted, but the patient cultivation of understanding in hearts that had been hardened by grief into shapes that could no longer recognize their own capacity for mercy. As spring's first tentative warmth began to soften the winter's harsh edges, she understood that the river of rage flowing through the distant valley could not be dammed or fought directly, but needed gentle channels carved with love and time, allowing its powerful current to transform destruction into something that might eventually nourish new growth. Her first letters carried no dramatic solutions or urgent demands for immediate reconciliation, but rather gentle invitations to remember what had been lost in the flood of fear, the knowledge that healing always begins with allowing wounds to be fully felt before they can transform into wisdom. Working through her network of correspondence, she began creating spaces where grief could exhaust itself naturally, like a fire that burns brightest just before it settles into steady warmth. Finn's role proved essential in ways that surprised them both, his healing abilities revealing new dimensions when applied to the spiritual wounds that grief creates in communities, developing herbal preparations that could ease the physical manifestations of trauma, while keeping hearts open to the possibility of comfort. The breakthrough came through a baker's wife named Merrin, whose own child had been lost to sudden illness the previous summer, and who understood the particular terror of watching a small life slip away from causes too swift for any parent to prevent. She began hosting quiet gatherings in her warm kitchen, offering fresh bread and patient ears to families whose grief had been transformed into weapons of vengeance. In the safety of shared understanding, some began to remember that their lost children had loved all living things, that the creatures they now hunted had once been sources of wonder rather than fear. When Mira finally made the journey north, she traveled not with grand pronouncements, but with a simple basket of Finn's calming teas and Elena's honey cakes, understanding that her role was to create space for transformation rather than to force it. She sat with the grieving family in their small, quiet house, listening to their stories of the lost child, feeling their rage flow through her like water through a clear vessel, acknowledged but not absorbed, witnessed but not hoarded. She offered no platitudes, only presence, her quiet empathy creating a sanctuary where pain could simply exist without requiring the destruction of other living things to feel meaningful. Simultaneously, she worked through the serpent network, helping them understand the human experience of loss, the overwhelming grief that could turn love into rage, the instinct to protect their young at all costs. Through Whisper's ancient wisdom, she explained that the human violence, though terrible, sprang from profound suffering rather than inherent evil. The Serpent Elders, with their patient understanding of cycles that stretched across centuries, began to speak among themselves of strategic retreat, allowing human grief time to run its course before attempting to re-establish contact. The pivotal moment came when the child's grandmother, a woman whose weathered hand still remembered gentler times, agreed to meet with an ancient serpent elder. Mira sat between them in Merrin's kitchen, serving as a bridge for raw, untranslated emotion. The grandmother spoke of her grandchild's laughter, the devastating emptiness of his absence. The serpent, through Mira's gift, communicated his species' ancient instinct to nurture, the pain of seeing his own young hunted, the longing for a world where all life could exist without threat. As they shared their mutual grief, something shifted in the room's atmosphere, the heavy weight of pain transforming into a recognition of shared vulnerability that transcended species boundaries. From this fragile beginning, new protocols emerged like flowers after rain. Communities began creating clear, safe pathways for serpents during seasonal migrations, constructing designated warming shelters away from human habitations using old pottery and river stones positioned to catch morning sun. Children learned to tap thresholds 3 times before entering, the 4th beat belonging to any serpent who might need time to leave with dignity. Blue cloth tied to fences marked serpent paths, while bells by doorsteps indicated houses where caution and kindness held daily conversations. The serpents altered their routes during the hours when children ran wild between chores and evening bread, laying scent ribbons along preferred paths, ancient signage that Mira translated into simple markers that frightened no one. When conflicts arose, protocols unfolded with practiced hands: calm assessment, gentle removal, alternative shelter, healing tea for shaken nerves. The man whose boot disturbed a defensive serpent lived and later built a small wooden shelter by his back door, a humble apology that snakes accepted without grudge. As summer deepened and the network of understanding continued to grow, letters began moving outward, carrying not tales of triumph but practical methods. The warming stones, the blue cloth markers, the fourth tap, the patient circles where grief could transform itself. Other valleys wrote back with small amendments that fit their particular weather and ways. The model spreading not through proclamation, but like water finding its natural course. When Mira returned to Seren's Rest, she carried exhaustion that felt like good work completed, and a quiet that reached her edges without breaking them. Finn met her at the herb garden's edge, with river stones and tea that tasted like meadows after rain. Above them, Rattlestar arranged its scales in patterns that spoke not of war's end, but of wisdom earned through patient love, its gentle rattling a cosmic approval that whispered, "Keep going exactly as slowly as you must." The Serpent War had revealed itself as one movement in a larger symphony, a necessary passage that had to be lived through rather than solved, until understanding could bloom from the composted remains of old fears and newer wisdom, could take root in ground prepared by countless gentle hands. The quiet that settled over Mira upon her return from the northern valley was not emptiness but spaciousness, as if the vastness of grief transformed into understanding had expanded the very chambers of her heart. The exhaustion she carried felt like good work completed, the deep weariness that comes from having given fully and discovered that in the giving, something essential had been received. Finn met her at the herb garden's edge, with river stones warmed by afternoon sun and tea that tasted like meadows after rain. His steady presence asking no questions, offering only the simple blessing of being understood without explanation. The rhythm that had carried her home unfolded into days that felt both familiar and subtly altered, as if the world had shifted a fraction toward better alignment while no one was looking. Above them, Rattlestar arranged its quiet scales in patterns that spoke not of war's end, but of wisdom earned through patient love, its gentle rattling a cosmic approval that whispered, "Keep going exactly as slowly as you must." The center breathed more steadily now, and Mira noticed that when she woke before dawn to sit with Whisper in the herb garden, the old serpent's presence infused her with steadiness that arrived from deeper wells than before. As spring deepened into summer, the visitors who came carried different energy from the first wave of desperate seekers. Many still brought problems to mend, grain store shelters to relocate, children's fears to soften, but increasingly they arrived with questions about practice rather than rescue. A quiet girl from the coastal marshlands appeared one morning, her eyes holding the shifting colors of tide pools and her hands always smelling faintly of salt and seaweed. Elara possessed a gift for communicating with birds, sensing the emotional currents that flowed through their flocks, the communal joy of successful fishing, the shared anxiety of approaching storms, the deep longing for migration that pulled them across vast skies. Mira recognized the familiar signs of a gift-seeking guidance. Hilara had been ostracized in her village, her whispered conversations with seagulls deemed strange, her sudden pronouncements about weather shifts dismissed as childish fancy. With Finn's gentle support, they taught her to ground her boundless empathy, to channel the immense energy of a flock's collective consciousness without losing her own small self in the process. Finn developed special tinctures of hawthorn and rosehip to strengthen her heart, helping her hold the vastness of birdsong without becoming overwhelmed. Soon after came Kyle, a boy from the deep forest, whose hands carried the permanent scent of pine resin and damp earth. He spoke with trees in their own slow, patient language of growth and decay, feeling the ancient wisdom of the forest as a deep thrum in his bones. Through him, Mira learned that gifts manifested in as many forms as there were ways of listening to the world's deeper rhythms. She helped Kyle translate the forest's slow wisdom into human understanding, while Finn showed him how to prepare healing poultices from fallen leaves and bark, teaching him to honor the tree's generosity even in their quiet offerings. The center evolved without anyone declaring it a school, growing organically as Finn began creating gentle structure around their expanding work. He drew a spiral in chalk on the slate wall by the kitchen, not as rigid curriculum, but as rhythm made visible. Morning, garden listening. Midday, service in the village. Afternoon, letters and mapping. Evening, stories and tea. It was less schedule than lullaby sung in 4 parts, designed to cradle sensitive hearts until they learned to cradle themselves. In the garden, Mira taught them Naya's wisdom of the 3 baskets. "This is yours," she would say, touching her palm. "This is theirs," a nod toward the lavender where Sage's descendants watched with liquid attention. "And this, the sky, the village, the river, that belongs to the world. Visit the second, glance at the third, but live in the first." She showed them how to hold warmed river stones rubbed with thyme, letting the scent act like a small lamp in darkened rooms, reminding them where their edges lay. Their reputation grew quietly through grateful hearts and peaceful gardens, through children who no longer ran screaming when they glimpsed wild creatures, through communities that had learned to make space for different forms of consciousness. Elena began packing larger lunches, understanding that her daughter's calling now extended across vast networks of understanding. Thomas expanded his shelter-building project, creating warming stations and safe passages that helped all manner of creatures navigate human spaces without causing alarm. Letters began flowing in both directions now, carrying not just requests for help, but reports of success, small innovations, gentle solutions that communities had discovered by applying the principles they had learned. A mountain village wrote of children leaving warm stones for serpents before first frost. A riverside settlement shared how their evening bells now rang 4 times instead of 3, the extra chime creating space for any creature needing a moment's warning. These developments had grown naturally from communities that had learned to listen to their own capacity for compassion. Naya, her earthly form growing lighter as her spirit prepared for larger journeys, spent peaceful afternoons watching this flowering of collaborative healing. The bone spiral she had passed to Mira now rested comfortably against her granddaughter's throat, no longer vibrating with urgent purpose, but holding steady warmth that spoke of wisdom finding its proper home. During their evening walks around the center's perimeter, she shared insights that felt like gifts wrapped in ordinary conversation. "The calling grows larger as we grow older," she observed one twilight, her weathered hands gentle on Mira's arm. "Eventually it outgrows the small vessel of a single life. When that happens, we choose whether to resist the expansion or allow ourselves to become part of something greater." Her words carried no urgency, only the patient recognition of patterns that repeated across generations of bridge builders and peace weavers. As autumn painted the world in shades of gold and amber, Mira began to sense her role shifting from active intervention to something closer to gardening, tending seeds that others had planted, helping new growth find its way toward light in communities she would never visit. Her connection to the serpent realm, once limited to their immediate region, now stretched across vast distances with ease that sometimes left her feeling untethered from her own small body. During morning rituals, her consciousness would drift along threads of awareness connecting her to serpent communities in lands she had never seen, their emotional landscapes as familiar as the herbs growing outside her window. The students who gathered around their kitchen table in the evenings represented something unprecedented, a generation that would grow up understanding empathy as a practical skill, rather than mystical accident. They shared the day's discoveries with voices that grew slower as stars climbed, failures welcomed with the same curiosity as successes. Before bed, they tied strips of blue cloth to the garden's outer fence, reminders that this was a shared path where caution and kindness could hold the same conversation. In the space between heartbeats, where all conflicts resolve into harmony, Mira felt the ancient song of unity growing stronger, carried not by dramatic gestures, but by countless small acts of understanding. The rattling of Rattlestar had evolved into something like a cosmic lullaby, no longer her private companion, but a universal rhythm that blessed the work of all who had learned to listen with love instead of fear. The Serpent War, in its deepest sense, had revealed itself not as a battle between species, but as the patient restoration of harmony, one gentle bridge built at a time, until the web of compassion grew strong enough to hold the whole world in its embrace. Somewhere in the gentle darkness above, the cosmic serpent arranged its quiet scales into patterns that spoke of networks and connections, of love made manifest in service to understanding, promising that every bridge built with patience would hold. No matter what storms might come to test its strength, the promises whispered in starlight and carried forward by countless gentle hands began to settle into the natural rhythm of seasons passing, each year adding not weight but depth to the work that had grown far beyond any single heart's capacity to hold. Mira felt time not as loss but as widening, her days expanding to contain more sky, more listening that reached past hedgerows and hills, past the river's slow meditation, into distances that made her individual. Story feel both precious and beautifully small within the vast tapestry of awakening consciousness that was slowly unfurling across the earth. The center breathed with the seasons now, expanding and settling like a sleeping creature, adjusting to deeper comfort. Students arrived not just from neighboring villages, but from distant lands, carried by stories that traveled through networks of understanding Mira had never imagined possible. Ilara had grown into a teacher herself, leading dawn walks by the river, where children learned to read the subtle weather songs that birds carried in their collective voice. Gale organized gentle circles beneath the ancient willow, inviting visitors to place their palms against bark and listen for the sap-slow speech that trees shared in their patient centuries of growth. Naya grew lighter with each passing season, the way candlelight thins as the wick turns to ember, her weathered form becoming translucent as her spirit prepared for larger journeys. She preferred the west bench where late sun pooled warmest, and when Mira sat beside her, their hands found each other without searching, their shared silence more eloquent than any words could be. The bone spiral at Mira's throat held steady warmth now, no longer pulsing with urgent purpose, but humming with the deep contentment of wisdom finding its proper home. "There comes a day," Naya whispered one afternoon, while mint released its cool breath around them, "when the basket you've carried becomes full of days. You don't close it then. You open it wide and let the fragrance rise to bless whatever comes next." Her words carried no urgency, only the patient recognition of patterns that repeated across generations of bridge builders and peace weavers. When her final morning came, the house knew before any of them spoke the word. The floorboards gentled their creaks, the kettle sang softer, and Rattlestar lingered pale in the brightening sky, like a secret the day would carry faithfully forward. As Naya's gentle breathing finally stilled, something profound shifted in Mira's awareness. The rattling of the constellation above, which had been her private lullaby since childhood, began to deepen into something far beyond sound or sensation. During quiet hours in the garden, her consciousness would drift along threads of connection that stretched across vast distances, touching serpent communities in lands she had never visited, sensing the emotional landscapes of creatures whose forms she could barely imagine. But more than that, she began to perceive the vast web of empathy that connected not just serpents, but all living things, a network of understanding that pulsed with the same gentle rhythm as her own heartbeat. She understood now that her individual gift had always been part of something much larger, a cosmic process of awakening that was occurring simultaneously in countless places across the known world, carried forward by healers and bridge builders whose names she would never know but whose work strengthened the growing web of compassion. Finn noticed the change in her touch, the way her healing presence seemed to address wounds of the spirit that went deeper than physical ailment. "You're becoming translucent," he observed one evening as they walked their familiar paths, his words carrying wonder rather than concern. "Like you're learning to let more light pass through." His steady love remained her anchor as her awareness expanded, his presence creating safe harbor for a consciousness that was slowly learning to navigate between earthly and cosmic territories. The students sensed it too, gathering around her with the instinctive recognition that young creatures show when approaching something sacred. Her teaching evolved from active instruction to something closer to gardening, creating space for understanding to bloom naturally, asking questions that unlocked each student's own capacity for listening. She helped them recognize that their gifts were not possessions to be hoarded, but bridges to be built, connections that served something far larger than individual achievement. Their days developed a contemplative rhythm that felt like a gentle liturgy of service. Mornings began with garden listening, afternoons with letters and mapping the growing network of understanding, evenings with stories and tea that tasted like meadows after rain. The center became a place of quiet pilgrimage, drawing not just those seeking practical help, but mystics and scholars who came simply to experience the profound peace that seemed to emanate from its sun-drenched courtyards. As winter approached, and the cosmic serpent above arranged its scales in patterns that spoke of completion and new beginning, Mira began to prepare without calling it preparation. She spent more time with each student individually, passing along not just techniques, but the deeper understanding that made such work possible. She created a small book of practices that felt more like lullabies than instruction, containing the simple ways of being that had held them through every storm. The 3 baskets, the 4th tap, the warmed stone, and always the question that unlocked listening. What have you noticed? In the space between heartbeats, where all conflicts resolve into harmony, she could feel the ancient song of unity growing stronger, carried not by dramatic gestures, but by countless small acts of understanding. The rattling of Rattlestar had evolved into something like a cosmic lullaby, no longer her private companion, but a universal rhythm that blessed all who had learned to build bridges instead of walls, to choose understanding over conquest, to trust in the patient power of love to transform even the deepest conflicts into harmony. Whisper, now so ancient her scales seemed to hold moonlight even in daylight, would coil beside Mira during evening meditations, her presence a living reminder that some connections transcend individual lifetimes. Together they sat in the garden where it all began, feeling the gentle pull of larger currents, preparing for the transformation that would allow love to expand beyond the boundaries of any single story, into the vast, eternal song that holds all beings in its tender embrace, in the transformation that had been gathering like morning mist at the edges of... Awareness finally arrived, not with fanfare, but with the gentle inevitability of seasons turning, as natural as breathing becoming song. On a night when Rattlestar blazed with unusual intensity, each scale of the cosmic serpent, catching starlight in patterns that pulsed with the rhythm of her own slowing heart, Mira felt the ancient current that had carried her since childhood, beginning to call her home to its vast, eternal embrace. She was not afraid, for she had learned through decades of patient listening that endings were simply another form of beginning, like the serpent shedding its skin to reveal new growth beneath. In the garden where her journey had begun, she gathered her chosen family one final time, not to say goodbye, but to plant seeds that would bloom long after her individual story had dissolved into the greater song that holds all beings in its tender care. With Thomas's steady hands and Kyle's forest wisdom, they built a spiral of river stones in the garden's heart, each one warmed by afternoon sun and smoothed by countless tides. At its center, Mira placed a small hollow lined with mint and lavender stems, a secret chamber where breath could collect and transform into blessing. Into this hidden heart, she gently laid Naya's bone spiral, not as an ending passed down, but as a promise returned to the earth that had loaned it. The students watched with reverent understanding as Ilara tied strips of sky-blue cloth from the old willow to the cottage eaves, creating pathways that would guide any creature seeking the gentlest route to safety. Finn felt the shift in her touch before she spoke of it, his healer's sensitivity attuned to the subtle changes that spoke of preparation for a journey beyond earthly boundaries. He made no attempt to hold her to physical form, understanding that love sometimes means releasing what we cherish most into its larger destiny. Instead, he simply offered the same steady presence that had anchored her through every storm, brewing teas that tasted like meadows after rain and arranging warm stones in spirals that mirrored the constellation above. As twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, the community gathered without being called, drawn by the instinctive recognition that something sacred was unfolding. They came with grateful hearts and quiet voices, the baker with flour still dusting his gentle hands, the weaver whose fingers no longer trembled at the sight of serpents, children who had learned to count with a 4th tap that always left space for understanding. They shared bread broken into quiet halves and tea that carried the essence of every herb that had ever grown in love's careful tending. Mira's voice, when she spoke, seemed to arise not from her individual consciousness, but from the vast network of understanding that connected all living things. "The work continues," she whispered, her words flowing like water finding its destined course toward the sea. Not because I am here, but because love itself has remembered how to speak through human hearts. You are each bridges in the great rebuilding, and every gentle choice you make rings like a bell across the connections we have woven together. Her students, now teachers, in their own right, nodded with the deep understanding of those who had learned to listen with their whole beings. Ilara would continue greeting the sky at dawn, teaching communities to read the weather songs that birds carried in their collective voice. Kyle would guide hands to bark and soil, helping others hear the sap-slow speech that trees shared in their patient centuries. The network of correspondence would carry their methods like seeds on the wind, planting gardens of understanding in distant lands. As her breathing began to slow to match the ancient rhythm of the earth itself, Mira felt her individual awareness dissolving into something vast and eternal. The rattling of Rattlestar became a lullaby that welcomed her home to the cosmic consciousness from which she had never truly been separate. Through Whisper's ancient presence, she established her final gift, a permanent bridge between human and serpent consciousness that would endure beyond physical form, continuing to facilitate understanding between species for generations yet to come. In the garden where she had first learned to listen to serpent wisdom, flowers bloomed out of season, their petals catching starlight as if the earth itself were offering tribute. The serpents gathered in a spiral pattern that mirrored the constellation above, their collective presence a living testament to the peace she had helped create. Whisper, now so ancient her scales seemed woven from moonlight and memory, coiled at the center of this living mandala, her touch a gentle blessing that everyone somehow understood. Finn felt her presence not as absence, but as expansion, her love now flowing through the very air he breathed, the water that nourished their garden, the starlight that blessed their evening walks. As her chest rose and fell with the cosmic rhythm that had always carried her, he traced slow spirals on her palm, each circle a reminder of every doorway they had opened together, every bridge they had built with patient hands and loving hearts. When her breathing finally stilled, it did so not as an ending but as a transformation, her consciousness merging with the vast web of empathy that connected all living things. The night held everything in gentle reverence, students and serpents, lovers and letters, the hidden chamber beneath the spiral where scent and memory had agreed to meet forever. Dawn found the garden exactly as it most wanted to be, with flowers blooming in defiant beauty and blue strips breathing in unison along the fence. The bridge worked the way bridges do, sometimes unnoticed, sometimes the only thing. Those who rested a hand on the center stone felt a soft assurance that needed no words. You are not alone. Go gently, make room. Far away, bells learned to ring 4 times instead of 3, and children discovered that the 4th tap always left space for kindness to enter. The story ends as all true stories do, not with conclusion, but with continuation, spiraling outward like the constellation that bore witness to a life dedicated to bridging spaces between all living things. And with that she stretched into the stars, becoming part of the vast, gentle song that holds all beings in its loving embrace, her voice joining the cosmic serpent's eternal lullaby that promises love endures, understanding grows, and every bridge built in patience will hold, no matter what storms may come to test its strength. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.